The manager's grip on my wrist wasn't violent. That was what frightened me. It was precise, urgent, like someone trying to stop a disaster that had already started. He pulled me through a narrow door beside the hostess stand, away from the dimming restaurant floor, away from the last murmurs of closing time conversations. The office smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. The door locked behind us with a dull, final click. "Please," he said quietly, his voice stripped of all professional polish. "Whatever you see, do not scream." That was the moment my body understood something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. My name is Claire Whitman. I don't panic easily. I built a logistics company into a regional powerhouse after my father's death. I negotiate contracts that make grown men sweat without raising my voice. I believe in data, documentation, and patterns, not paranoia. And yet, standing in that small office, I felt the air thin around me. 30 minutes earlier, my life had looked flawless. It was our third wedding anniversary, a high-rise restaurant with glass walls and soft lighting, the kind of place where silence feels expensive. My husband, Daniel, sat beside me, attentive in a way people envy. Calm, dependable, the man everyone said I was lucky to have. Across from us sat his mother, leaner, poised, and observant, her smile sharp enough to cut without drawing blood. Next to her was Brooke, the woman Daniel once described as a foster sister from his childhood. Sweet, helpful, always watching. That night, they were perfect. Daniel asked about my headaches. Eleanor said stress could do strange things to strong women. Brooke refilled my wine before I noticed the glass was empty. They told me to rest more, to let Daniel handle things, to trust them. And I did. Because manipulation doesn't arrive screaming. It arrives smiling. Here's the part no one tells you. When people plan to take something from you, they first convince you that you're tired. When I realized my purse was missing, embarrassment burned hotter than concern. Inside it were documents I never misplace. My phone, my medication. Daniel reacted instantly, calm and reassuring. He offered solutions before I finished speaking. He insisted on driving me back. Then hesitated, just long enough to look caring, when I said I'd go alone. That hesitation mattered. Because people who are innocent argue harder. As the rideshare pulled away, I saw Daniel standing under the streetlight, motionless. Watching, not worried, not distracted. Waiting. Back at the restaurant, the lights were lower. Chairs already flipped onto tables. That's when the manager stepped into my path. Now, in his office, he gestured toward the wall of security monitors. "One of my responsibilities," he said carefully, "is reviewing footage before closing." He swallowed. "And your table stood out." The screen showed a wide angle of the dining room. Table 12. Our table. I saw myself stand up, walk away, my purse left behind. Everything looked normal. Then Daniel shifted. The smile vanished from his face like it had been switched off. He scanned the room, not casually, but deliberately. His hand slid into my purse with confidence that suggested practice. He didn't hesitate, didn't search. He knew exactly where to reach. I felt my pulse in my ears as he removed a small white bottle. My bottle. He unscrewed the lid, poured the capsules into a napkin, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Then he took out another packet. The pills looked identical. He replaced them, shook the bottle once, returned it precisely where it had been. Across the table, Eleanor laughed. Not shocked, not concerned. Amused. Brooke leaned toward Daniel, touched his arm, and smiled like someone admiring a job well done. They raised their glasses. They toasted. The screen froze. I didn't realize I was gripping the desk until my fingers started to ache. The manager placed another bottle in front of me. "My staff found this in the restroom trash," he said quietly, "after your husband went in." Then he said the sentence that shattered the last illusion I had left. "Those aren't supplements. They were illegal psychotropic drugs, slow-acting, designed not to kill but to erode memory loss, confusion, emotional instability. Symptoms that look exactly like mental illness." My phone vibrated. Daniel was calling. And in that instant, everything aligned. The concern, the timing, the patience. This wasn't about love. It was about control. I answered the phone with a steady voice. "I found my purse," I said. "I'm heading home." I smiled as I spoke. Because the most dangerous moment isn't when you discover the truth. It's when the people who betrayed you believe you still don't know. And tonight, I was going to let them believe exactly that. Because once I walked back into that house, every word I spoke would become a weapon, and the people trying to destroy me had no idea I'd already started recording the war. I didn't rush home. Rushing would have raised questions. Instead, I let the city lights blur past the car window and slowed my breathing until my reflection looked as calm as the woman Daniel believed he controlled. Panic wastes energy. Precision wins wars. By the time I reached the house, I had already made my first decision. I would not confront anyone. Not Daniel. Not Alina. Not Brooke. Confrontation is for people who want explanations. I wanted evidence. Daniel opened the door before I reached the handle. His smile was warm, practiced, familiar. The kind that used to make me feel safe. Now it looked like a mask worn too long. "There you are," he said softly, pulling me into a hug that lasted half a second longer than necessary. I was worried. Worried people don't replace your medication. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left it. Too exactly. The living room was spotless. The air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. On the coffee table sat a glass of water and my white pill bottle, positioned carefully in the center like an offering. Daniel followed my eyes and nodded. "Take it before bed," he said. "You've been restless lately." That was the test. I picked up the pill, placed it on my tongue, lifted the glass, and swallowed, or at least I made it look that way. Years ago, during a business trip overseas, I'd learned how to hide a tablet beneath my tongue without gagging. Daniel watched my throat closely, then relaxed. People who lie watch for confirmation. People who trust do not. He kissed my forehead and told me to rest. Said he'd join me later. I nodded, let my shoulders slump, let my steps slow as I climbed the stairs. Once inside the bathroom, I locked the door and spit the pill into a tissue. My hands were steady. My reflection was not wild-eyed or frantic. I looked awake. That night, I didn't sleep. I listened. For weeks, I had been hearing whispers, my name spoken softly, just loud enough to feel real, just quiet enough to doubt. Every time I mentioned it, Daniel and Alina exchanged that look. The one that said concern on the surface and confirmation underneath. Stress, they told me. Overwork, anxiety. But stress doesn't blink red in the dark. Around 2 in the morning, I turned on my phone's flashlight and scanned the bedroom slowly. Nothing under the bed, nothing in the closet, nothing behind the curtains. Then my eyes settled on the framed artwork across from the bed. A gift from Alina, given with a smile that felt too deliberate. I lifted it from the wall. Behind the frame, taped neatly to the backing, was a small black speaker. A faint red light pulsed slowly, like a heartbeat. I took photos, several, different angles. Then I put everything back exactly as it had been. Because predators notice changes. As I turned away, I heard voices downstairs. I moved quietly to the top of the staircase and listened from the shadowed hallway. Daniel and Brooke were on the couch, not sitting apart, not like family. Her head rested against his shoulder. His fingers threaded through her hair with familiarity that erased every lie I'd ever been told about her place in our lives. "They're working," Daniel said, his voice relaxed, satisfied. "The pills, the speaker, all of it." Brooke laughed softly. She looked so lost lately, the board's already whispering. Daniel nodded. "Tomorrow finishes it." Brooke shifted closer. "Then we don't have to pretend anymore." I recorded everything. Not just the words, the tone, the certainty, the entitlement. They spoke about my company like it was already theirs, about my house like it was temporary storage, about me like a problem being quietly solved. When their footsteps moved toward the kitchen, I slipped back into the bedroom and lay down, heart steady, breathing shallow. Daniel came in later, kissed my forehead, whispered goodnight like nothing had happened. That was the moment something inside me hardened. Morning arrived without ceremony. I played my role carefully. Slow movements, a dull headache, just enough confusion to keep Daniel confident. Confidence makes careless men sloppy. When Daniel and Alina left for errands, I moved fast. I called Andrew Collins. He had been my father's attorney for decades, a man who believed in paper trails and patience. When I told him my safety depended on his discretion, he didn't ask questions. He arrived through the back entrance within 30 minutes. I showed him everything. The pills, the speaker, the recording. Andrew didn't interrupt, didn't comfort, didn't speculate. He listened like a man building a case in his head brick by brick. Then we went to Daniel's office. The spare key was exactly where I remembered it, hidden poorly, because Daniel never imagined I'd need it. Inside the safe were documents prepared with chilling confidence. Petitions declaring me mentally unfit, forged evaluations, bank transfers disguised as operational expenses. And then Andrew found the passport. Brooke Miller wasn't her name. Tucked beside it was a photograph, a small civil wedding ceremony. Daniel and Brooke, years ago, long before me. This wasn't betrayal. It was infiltration. We barely had time to finish documenting everything before a car pulled into the driveway. Daniel was home early. Andrew stepped into the closet just as the office door opened. I turned slowly, let confusion soften my posture, and told Daniel the voices had guided me here. His expression shifted. Suspicion melted into satisfaction. He touched my shoulder gently. "It's okay," he said. "I've got you." And that's when I knew. The trap was fully set. Because the next day, Daniel would walk me into a boardroom, believing he was about to erase me, unaware that every step forward was dragging him closer to his own collapse. The morning of the board meeting arrived, wrapped in quiet confidence. Not mine. Daniel. He moved through the house like a man already rehearsing his victory speech. Calm, focused, efficient. He poured coffee, adjusted his cufflinks, checked his phone twice, not for messages, but for reassurance. People who are about to betray, you don't look nervous. They look relieved. I played my role perfectly. I moved slower than usual, let my gaze drift just a little too long, asked him to repeat simple things. Daniel noticed everything and interpreted it exactly the way he wanted to. "Big day," he said gently, squeezing my hand. "You don't need to talk much, just listen." That was the second test. I nodded. Silence, after all, was the version of me he preferred. The drive to Hudson Tower felt longer than usual. The city slid past the window in sharp lines of glass and steel. Daniel kept his hand wrapped around mine, grounding, guiding, not affectionate, but corrective. as if I were something fragile he needed to keep from breaking in public. Hudson Tower rose ahead of us, polished and imposing. My father's name was etched into the stone at the entrance. Seeing it steadied me in a way no pill ever could. Inside the elevator, Daniel explained that a medical professional would be present just in case. His voice was soft, but the implication was sharp. Step out of line, and you will be handled. The boardroom doors opened to a room already full. Familiar faces turned toward me, some concerned, some cautious, some already convinced of a story I hadn't been allowed to tell. Rumors travel faster than truth when silence is encouraged. Daniel guided me to the chair at the head of the table, my chair. Then he sat beside me. Ownership matters to men like him. The meeting began smoothly. Daniel spoke about responsibility, about protecting the company, about continuity and stability. His words were reasonable, measured, convincing. Then, slowly, he shifted the focus. He spoke about my health, about my confusion, my exhaustion, my unpredictability. Medical reports were passed around, evaluations written in confident language by a doctor who had never spoken to me privately. Legal documents followed, proposals for temporary authority, framed as compassion. A man in a white coat stood near the wall, hands folded, watching me closely. Daniel turned to me with practiced concern. "Claire," he said, "do you want to say anything?" Every eye in the room landed on me. I lowered my head. Silence stretched. The tension thickened, exactly as Daniel intended. Whispers passed between board members. Doubt hardened into consensus. Daniel continued, explaining that a temporary transfer of authority would protect both me and the company. He believed this was the end. What he didn't understand was that silence doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes it means timing. I lifted my head. The room stilled. I stood. The movement alone disrupted everything. Conversations stopped. Daniel turned toward me sharply, his confidence flickering for the first time. "I am not unwell," I said calmly. Daniel laughed softly, shaking his head. "This is exactly what I was worried about," he told the room. "She doesn't realize." "And I am not confused," I continued. That's when the doors opened. Andrew Collins walked in first, his presence commanding without effort. Behind him were two uniformed officers, and just behind them stood a man no one in the room recognized, except Daniel. The restaurant manager. Confusion rippled across the boardroom. Daniel stood up. "This is inappropriate," he said loudly. "She's having an episode." I didn't raise my voice. "My husband," I said evenly, "has been drugging me with illegal psychotropic medication to manufacture the appearance of mental instability." Daniel froze. Andrew pressed a button on the laptop. The screen filled with security footage. Daniel opening my purse. Replacing the pills. Eleanor laughing. Brooke watching. Gasps moved through the room like a wave. Then the audio played. Daniel's voice. Brooke's laughter. Talk of removing me. Of spending my money. Daniel lunged toward the screen. An officer stopped him. Andrew followed with financial records, transfers hidden as expenses, forged approvals, luxury purchases routed through shell accounts. Finally, the photograph appeared. A wedding photo. Daniel and Brooke. Dated years before my marriage. The room fell silent. Daniel sank into his chair. The doctor stepped back, pale. The board members didn't look at him anymore. They looked at me. The vote was immediate. Daniel was removed from all authority, his access revoked, accounts frozen, investigations launched. As the officers cuffed him, Daniel looked at me, not with anger but disbelief. I met his gaze calmly. Because the story he had written for me was over, and the truth had finally been allowed to speak. But what the board didn't yet know, what even Daniel couldn't imagine, was that the fallout wouldn't stop with him, because the deepest betrayal was still waiting to surface. When the officers led Daniel out of the boardroom, no one spoke. Not because they didn't have questions, but because every answer they thought they had was wrong. The doors closed behind him, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the confrontation itself. Papers lay scattered across the table. Faces that had once looked confident now looked exposed. I remained standing. Not because I needed to prove strength, but because sitting felt like permission. The board chair cleared his throat and spoke carefully, choosing every word as if the room itself were recording. Emergency measures were enacted on the spot. Daniel's access was terminated. An independent audit was ordered. Legal counsel was summoned. No one asked me how I felt. That told me everything I needed to know. People rarely ask how you're doing when they're recalculating their own liability. I left the building alone. For the first time in months, I wasn't being guided, corrected, or watched. The city outside felt sharper, louder, more real. I inhaled deeply and realized something unsettling. I wasn't relieved. I was alert. Because exposure doesn't end a threat, it changes its shape. That night, Alina was arrested at the house. The charges weren't dramatic, not at first. Financial fraud, conspiracy, obstruction, the kind of offenses that look smaller on paper than they feel in practice. Brooke was detained separately. She cried. Not because she was remorseful, but because she was unprepared to lose. The house was searched top to bottom. Devices were seized, files collected. The walls finally gave up their secrets, every hidden speaker, every recording, every deliberate whisper. I slept alone in a hotel that night. No medication, no voices. Just silence. In the days that followed, the narrative shifted. Publicly, it was framed as a corporate restructuring following internal misconduct. Privately, it was chaos. Lawyers circled. Accounts were frozen. The media sniffed around the edges, searching for a story they couldn't yet name. And then the letters started arriving. From board members. From partners. From people who had watched me unravel quietly and chosen not to intervene. Most of them said the same thing. We were concerned. Concern, I learned, is often what people call inaction after the fact. The investigation widened quickly. Alina's history surfaced: shell companies, strategic marriages, quiet dissolutions that left others depleted. Daniel wasn't her first project, just her most ambitious. Brooke's real identity unraveled next. She wasn't a foster sister. She was a collaborator. Their marriage, discovered during the audit, wasn't romantic. It was contractual. A partnership formed to access assets they couldn't reach alone. I had been the final piece. The solvent. And once I was drained, they planned to discard me with medical paperwork and sympathetic sighs. I attended every meeting after that. Not because I owed anyone reassurance, but because visibility is protection. I spoke calmly, precisely, without emotion. People listen differently when you no longer ask to be believed. The company stabilized under temporary leadership while the audit continued. Projects resumed. Staff watched closely, waiting for signs of weakness. They didn't get any. But strength has a cost. At night alone, the weight settled in. Not grief, clarity. I replayed conversations, smiles, gestures that now carried different meanings. The way Alina watched me eat. The way Daniel corrected my memory casually, almost kindly. Gaslighting doesn't feel like abuse when it's wrapped in concern. It feels like doubt. And doubt is quieter than fear. One evening, as I sat in the hotel room reviewing documents, my phone vibrated with an unknown number. I almost ignored it. Almost. The voice on the other end was low, controlled, female. She didn't introduce herself. "You think it's over," she said. "It is." I didn't respond. Silence unsettles people who expect panic. "They didn't act alone," she continued, "and you've only seen the surface." The line went dead. I stared at the phone for a long time. Because threats don't scare me. Patterns do. The next morning, Andrew confirmed what my instincts already suspected. Funds had moved shortly before the arrests, not large enough to trigger alarms, but deliberate. Someone else was cleaning up. Someone who hadn't been in the boardroom. Someone who hadn't needed to be. I closed my laptop and stood. Winning one battle doesn't end a war. It tells the enemy to stop being careless. And as the investigation turned outward, I realized the most dangerous person in this story wasn't the one who got caught, but the one who had never been seen at all. The problem with pulling a thread is that you don't get to choose what unravels. Once Andrew confirmed the quiet fund transfers, the case stopped being about Daniel. It stopped being about a leaner. Even Brooke faded into irrelevance. Those were visible players, disposable ones. The real concern was precision. The money hadn't moved in panic. No rushed withdrawals. No obvious flight pattern. It had been sliced thinly, rooted through dormant entities that had existed for years, waiting. That told me two things. First, someone expected this outcome. Second, someone had planned for life after Daniel. Andrew and I sat across from each other in a private conference room, documents spread between us like a map of buried landmines. He didn't speculate. He traced. "These companies," he said, tapping the page, "aren't a leaner's style, too restrained, too patient." That was when I understood what the anonymous caller had meant. They didn't act alone. For the first time since the boardroom, I felt something close to anger, not explosive, not emotional, but cold and focused. The kind that sharpens memory instead of blurring it. I started reviewing everything again, not just transactions, interactions. Who had suggested the doctor? Who had introduced Daniel to certain consultants? Who had quietly endorsed the idea that I was overextended? The answer kept circling back to one name. Marcus Hale. He was a strategic advisor, not officially employed, always present when needed, invisible when not. He had been recommended years ago by a mutual contact my father once trusted. Marcus didn't make decisions. He framed them. He never pushed, he nudged. When I dug into his background, it was immaculate. Too immaculate. Short-term advisory roles, non-disclosure agreements, no scandals, no loyalty. People like Marcus don't build empires. They extract them. I requested a meeting. Not formally, not through channels. I sent a message that suggested vulnerability, uncertainty about my position, concern about the audit, a need for guidance. He replied within minutes. We met in a quiet lounge overlooking the river. Neutral ground, public enough to feel safe, private enough to speak freely. Marcus arrived calm, smiling, sympathetic. "You've been through a lot," he said. "Anyone would be shaken." There it was again. Concern. I told him I felt exposed, that I wasn't sure who to trust, that Daniel had handled so much behind the scenes and now I felt unsteady. I watched his eyes carefully. He didn't gloat. He didn't reassure too quickly. He listened. Then he said, "Transitions like this are dangerous. People will question your judgment." He paused, letting the words settle. You need someone neutral, he continued. Someone to help stabilize things quietly. That was the offer. Not power. Protection. I nodded slowly, asked what he recommended. Distance, he said. Let the board breathe. Let the narrative cool, step back temporarily. Voluntary absence. The same strategy Daniel had tried to force. I thanked him and left without committing. Because Marcus had just confirmed everything. That night, Andrew traced Marcus's connections, not direct transfers that would have been careless. Instead, influence, recommendations, legal referrals, consulting chains that always benefited from instability. Marcus didn't steal. He positioned himself where others did, then charged for cleanup. And suddenly, Daniel made sense. Daniel wasn't the architect. He was the instrument. The next move couldn't be loud. It had to be undeniable. I did exactly what Marcus suggested, publicly. I announced a brief step back, citing exhaustion and a desire for transparency during the audit. The press framed it as humility. The board framed it as responsibility. Marcus framed it as opportunity. Within days, he was everywhere, advising, guiding, helping. That's when we closed the net. Andrew worked with federal investigators quietly. Not accusations, patterns, influence peddling, obstruction through suggestion rather than instruction. Emails surfaced, calls, meeting logs. Marcus never ordered anything. He didn't have to. He implied. And implication leaves fingerprints when you follow it far enough. The call that broke everything came a week later. Marcus had reached out to Alina's former attorney. Not to defend her. To ensure she stayed silent. That's not crisis management. That's control. He was arrested 2 days later. Not dramatically, no boardroom, no spectacle. Just a quiet escort from an office he never owned but always dominated. The charges weren't public at first. They didn't need to be. His clients vanished overnight. People like Marcus survive on trust. Once it's gone, they disappear. I returned to the company a month later. Not to applause. To attention. Attention is more honest. I didn't speak about betrayal. I didn't tell my story publicly. I didn't need to. The truth was already doing its work. But there was still one thing left. Closure isn't justice. It's choice. Because with everyone else exposed, arrested, or erased, I finally had to decide what I would do with the power they tried to steal, and whether walking away would hurt them more than staying ever could. Power feels different when you get it back quietly. There was no announcement when I returned to the office. No statement, no applause, just a change in posture when I entered rooms. Conversations stopped adjusting themselves around me. People weren't sure which version of me had survived. That uncertainty was useful. The audit concluded without drama. The numbers spoke clearly. No instability, no mismanagement, no impairment. Every claim made against me dissolved under documentation. The board reinstated my full authority unanimously. Not out of loyalty. Out of fear of being wrong again. I didn't celebrate. Celebration suggests an ending. This wasn't an ending. It was a recalibration. The first thing I did was restructure the advisory layer. No silent consultants. No informal influence. Every recommendation would be documented, attributable, traceable. Some people resigned within days. They always do when shadows disappear. Daniel tried to contact me from custody. Once. The message was short, apologetic in tone, empty in substance. He said he'd been pressured, that he'd lost control, that he still cared. I didn't reply. Closure doesn't require conversation with the person who tried to erase you. Elinor never reached out. She didn't need to. Her entire strategy had been visibility, control through proximity. Without access, she had nothing left to trade. Brooke, however, wrote me a letter. Handwritten. It arrived folded carefully, as if neatness could undo intent. She didn't deny anything. She reframed it, said she'd loved Daniel, said she'd been promised security, said she'd believed I was strong enough to recover. That was the lie she told herself. I didn't respond. People who rationalize cruelty don't need your forgiveness. They need distance. Months passed. The company stabilized, partnerships resumed, staff relaxed, life returned to routine. And yet, something remained unresolved. Not revenge. Definition. Because when someone tries to rewrite your identity, to label you unstable, unreliable, unfit, survival isn't enough. You have to overwrite the narrative completely. So I did something unexpected. I invited the board to dinner. Not to discuss numbers, not strategy. I invited them to listen. I told them everything. Not emotionally, not dramatically, chronologically. How gaslighting works. How control hides behind concern. How easily intelligent people accept a story when it absolves them of responsibility. I didn't accuse. I explained. When I finished, no one spoke for a long time. Then one board member said quietly, "We failed you." I nodded. Acknowledgement mattered more than apology. After that night, something shifted. Decisions became sharper. Questions were asked sooner. Silence stopped being rewarded. That was the real consequence. Not arrests. Awareness. I moved out of the house Daniel and I had shared. Not because it hurt, but because it belonged to a version of me that no longer existed. I chose a smaller place overlooking the water. Open light. No corners for sound to hide. No walls thick enough to whisper through. The first night there, I slept without checking the walls. That was freedom. Sometimes people ask why I didn't destroy them publicly, why I didn't tell the press everything, why I didn't turn my life into a warning. Here's the truth. People who need spectacle were never listening in the first place. The ones who need to understand already know. I didn't walk away diminished. I walked away clarified. But clarity has a price, because once people realize they can't control you, they try something far more dangerous. They try to provoke you. Provocation doesn't arrive as an attack. It arrives as an invitation. The first sign came quietly, an opinion piece published online by a minor financial outlet. No accusations, just questions. Phrases like "sources suggest" and "concerns remain unresolved." It didn't name me directly. It didn't have to. The second came from a former associate who requested a meeting to clear the air. He spoke vaguely about perception, about optics, about how quickly confidence can erode if left unattended. I listened. Then I declined. Because when people can't control you privately, they try to destabilize you publicly. The narrative was subtle, almost respectful. That was the danger. It framed me not as a villain, but as a risk. Unpredictable, emotional, hardened by trauma. In other words, damaged. The same story. Different packaging. This time, however, I wasn't alone in the room. The board noticed it too. Not because they suddenly cared, but because destabilization threatens everyone who benefits from stability. Andrew traced the origins. The outlet had recently received funding from a shell entity with familiar architecture. Clean, indirect, designed to influence without exposure. Marcus's fingerprints were gone, but his methodology remained. Someone else had picked it up. I didn't respond publicly. Silence, when used intentionally, creates pressure. Instead, I did something less satisfying and far more effective. I invited scrutiny. Voluntarily. I commissioned an independent, third-party review, not just of finances, but of governance, decision-making protocols, and executive oversight. I opened records that didn't need opening. People who have something to hide don't do that. The narrative collapsed within days. Articles were quietly edited, mentions disappeared, concern evaporated, and the invitations stopped. That was when I understood something essential. Power doesn't come from being feared. It comes from being unmovable. Later that month, I received a call from a woman I didn't recognize. Her voice was controlled, professional. She said she had worked under a leaner years ago, that she'd seen the patterns, that when she heard what happened, she realized she wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't asking for help. She was offering testimony. One by one, others followed. Not to me, to investigators, to auditors, to journalists who now knew where to look. The network unraveled further than I expected. Alina hadn't just manipulated families. She'd cultivated silence. And silence doesn't survive light. I wasn't at the center of it. That mattered. Because true influence doesn't require you to be visible. It requires you to be consistent. One evening, as I walked along the water near my apartment, I realized I wasn't looking over my shoulder anymore. Not because there was no threat. Because there was no confusion. Confusion is what predators rely on. And I no longer provided it. Still, there was one final reckoning left, not with them, but with the version of myself that had trusted too easily, and the choice I had to make about who I would be next. The hardest reckoning doesn't happen in courtrooms or boardrooms. It happens alone. Long after the noise fades, long after the names stop mattering, when there's no one left to convince and nothing left to defend. That's when you finally meet yourself again. I didn't miss Daniel. I didn't miss the life we had built. What lingered was something quieter, the question no one asks out loud. How did I let this happen? Not in blame, in responsibility. Because intelligence doesn't make you immune to manipulation. It just makes you more convincing when you're lying to yourself. I had ignored small discomforts because they weren't dramatic. I had explained away unease because it felt inefficient to slow down. I had mistaken consistency for safety. Control thrives where trust goes unquestioned. I began therapy not because I was broken, but because clarity requires structure. We didn't talk about betrayal at first. We talked about boundaries, about patterns, about why capable people often tolerate subtle violations longer than obvious ones. Because subtle ones don't interrupt productivity. That realization stayed with me. I also made a decision that surprised people. I declined to return to the public-facing role everyone expected. No interviews, no keynote speeches, no inspirational narratives about resilience. Instead, I stepped into governance. Quietly, I restructured oversight frameworks, introduced protections that didn't rely on personality or goodwill, systems that assumed failure and planned for it. Because ethics shouldn't depend on trust. They should survive its absence. I mentored privately, women, executives, people who had felt something was wrong but couldn't articulate it without sounding difficult. I didn't give them courage. I gave them language. Language turns instinct into evidence. One afternoon, months later, I received a message from the restaurant manager, the man who had locked the door and shown me the truth. He wrote simply, "I still think about that night. I'm glad I didn't stay silent." So was I. Because silence isn't neutral. It either protects harm or exposes it. I never saw Alina again. Her case concluded quietly. She aged suddenly in the photographs that surfaced afterward, not because she was tired, but because control had finally left her hands. Brooke vanished from relevance entirely. That mattered too. Not everyone deserves an ending. As for Daniel, I heard he still tells people he was manipulated, that he loved me, that things went too far. People rewrite their motives when the original ones cost them everything. I don't correct the record. Truth doesn't require participation. The last thing I did before closing that chapter was simple. I removed my father's name from the building. Not because I rejected it, but because I no longer needed to live inside anyone else's legacy to justify my authority. I put my own there instead. Not larger. Not louder. Just permanent. Because the story didn't end with revenge or forgiveness. It ended with a question that now belongs to you. What would you do if silence was no longer an option? People expect stories like this to end with victory. A final confrontation. A public reckoning. A moment where everyone finally understands. That's not how it ends. It ends quietly. One morning, I woke up and realized I hadn't checked my phone for threats, updates, or confirmations. I hadn't rehearsed conversations in my head. I hadn't scanned rooms for shifts in tone or intention. My life had become ordinary again. And ordinary, after control, feels extraordinary. I returned to work without announcement. Meetings were efficient. Decisions were challenged openly. Disagreement no longer felt dangerous. It felt healthy. That was how I knew the system was finally working. Not because no one tried to dominate, but because no one could do it invisibly. I stopped being introduced as the woman who survived. I became simply the woman in charge. There's a difference. Survival looks backward. Authority looks forward. Occasionally, someone would ask me if I regretted staying quiet for so long, if I wished I had acted sooner, if I blamed myself. Here's the truth. Regret assumes you had the full picture. I didn't. Manipulation works by shrinking your field of vision until you believe confusion is your fault. Once you see clearly, the question isn't why didn't I act sooner? It's why did they need silence to win? I no longer measure people by how kind they appear. I measure them by how they behave when they think no one is watching. That lesson changed everything. I redesigned my life with intention. Fewer obligations, fewer explanations, more space, more control over my time, my environment, my access. Peace, I learned, is engineered, not granted. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about the woman I was before the restaurant, before the office, before the pills and the whispers. Not with shame. With respect. She trusted because she believed in continuity. She assumed people would reveal themselves through effort and consistency. She was wrong about some things. But she wasn't weak. She was unprepared. And preparation is something you can acquire. If there's one truth this experience carved into me, it's this. People who try to erase, you don't fear your anger. They fear your clarity. Because clarity doesn't argue. It doesn't beg. It doesn't rush. It waits. And when it speaks, it doesn't need volume, only proof. So if you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if you've been told you're too sensitive, too tired, too confused, pause. Especially if someone benefits from you believing that. Document everything. Trust patterns, not promises. And remember this. Silence is not weakness. It is strategy. And the moment you stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you, that's the moment your life starts to belong to you again. Because sometimes the strongest revenge isn't destruction. It's clarity and walking away with yourself fully intact.